The arrest that shook the street. It was a morning that seemed, at first glance, as ordinary as any other in the sprawling heart of the city. The early light of dawn filtered through skyscraper windows and bounced off the glass facades, scattering golden hues over the sidewalks below. The city was alive with its usual energy. Commuters clutched paper cups of coffee. Children in colorful backpacks hurried behind parents tugging at their hands. Shopkeepers rolled up shutters with the determination of beginning another day of hard work. In the middle of this rhythmic flow of life, Jamal West stood as though untouched by the rush. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement, his suit as sharp as his composure, and his very presence carried a quiet dignity that naturally drew glances. He wasn't just a man walking down the street. He was a man who seemed to belong everywhere, yet nowhere at once. His calm stride gave the impression of someone who knew exactly who he was and where he was going, even if the world around him did not. Jamal had just finished his usual breakfast at a small family-owned diner that he often frequented. The place was known for its warmth more than its menu. The staff greeted him by name, asked about his mother's health, and slipped him extra fruit on his plate just because they appreciated his kindness. That morning had been no different. Jamal had shared a few light-hearted words with the waitress, smiled at an elderly man seated near the counter, and then walked out into the morning air with his heart steady and his mind focused. His day promised meetings, case reviews, and a dinner with his mother, who remained the anchor of his life. Family was everything to Jamal. It was the lesson his father had taught him before passing away years earlier, and it was the compass by which he measured his decisions. Pulling his phone from his pocket, he glanced. Instead, a message from his mother. "Don't forget dinner at 7. I'm making your favorite. Love you." His lips curved into a soft smile, and he tapped out a reply promising he hadn't forgotten. It was this gentle moment, this reminder of love and normalcy, that was shattered the instant two police officers walked into his path. They moved with a deliberate kind of authority, their eyes trained on him like searchlights, their expressions carrying no hint of warmth. The city's noise seemed to fade behind the weight of their presence. Jamal instinctively slowed, the lessons his father had drilled into him whispering in his memory. Stay calm, stay respectful, keep your hands visible, never give them a reason to escalate. The taller of the two, whose badge read Riley, called out with a tone that was more command than request. "Excuse me, sir, can we see some ID?" His partner Jenkins stood slightly behind him, his hand casually resting on his belt near his holster, as if prepared for a confrontation that hadn't even begun. The air around them seemed to thicken, and though Jamal had endured encounters like this before, something about this particular moment carried a sharper edge. He wasn't just being stopped, he was being targeted. Still, Jamal's voice was steady as he replied, "Yes, officer, may I ask why?" He knew his rights, but he also knew the fragile line he walked. Too much defiance could spark unnecessary danger. Too much silence could erase his dignity. Riley's lips curved into a smirk, his eyes narrowing as though amused that Jamal had dared to question him. "Just show us your ID, simple request." His tone dripped with unspoken meaning. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Slowly, with deliberate movements, Jamal reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet, and handed over his driver's license. Even as he did, he asked again with quiet dignity, "I'd still like to know why I'm being stopped." Jenkins shifted on his feet, eyes darting over Jamal's suit, his car, his watch, as though searching for something to justify what his instincts were already accusing. Riley looked at the ID, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he demanded, ignoring Jamal's earlier question. "I had breakfast at the diner down the street," Jamal answered, his brow furrowing just slightly. "Is there a problem?" Riley's smirk widened. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. You match the description of someone we're looking for." Jamal's chest tightened. It was the same recycled narrative he had heard before. Black man, well-dressed, in the wrong place. It was a crime in itself in the eyes of men like Riley and Jenkins. "I see," he replied carefully. "Well, I'm sure it's a misunderstanding. I'm just heading to my car and then to work." "What kind of work?" Riley pressed, his eyes sharp with suspicion. I'm a lawyer, Jamal answered, steady and measured, though inside he felt the walls of the trap closing in. The word seemed to throw Riley off balance for a heartbeat, but he recovered quickly. Jenkins chuckled, his voice laced with mockery. A lawyer, huh? Sure. You hiding anything in that car? Drugs? Weapons? Something that'd explain why you're so nervous? Jamal kept his composure, though his blood ran hot with injustice. There's nothing illegal in my car. You're welcome to check, though I'd prefer if you didn't waste your time. But Riley's eyes hardened. You don't get to tell us how to do our job. Step away from the car. The moment hung heavy, every second threatening to collapse into chaos. Jamal hesitates. Ted only briefly, his father's voice echoing again. Stay calm, stay smart, survive the moment. Raising his hand slightly to show he posed no threat, he stepped back. But Riley's move was sudden, calculated, and cruel. He seized Jamal's arm, twisting it behind his back. Pain shot through Jamal's shoulder, and before he could process it, Jenkins was shoving him toward the pavement. The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, cold and biting. You're under arrest for resisting arrest, Riley declared with chilling irony. A crowd was gathering now. An elderly woman named Mrs. Carter, who often saw Jamal walking in the neighborhood, leaned over her balcony and shouted, "He didn't do anything wrong!" A young man pulled out his phone and began recording, whispering to his girlfriend, "They're arresting him for nothing." The onlookers' voices swelled in protest, but Riley and Jenkins ignored them, their faces masks of authority unchecked. Jamal, wincing from the pain, forced himself to speak, his voice calm, yet resolute. This isn't over. His words carried through the glass as they shoved him into the squad car. The crowd fell into a stunned silence, those three words burning in their minds like a promise. Inside the cold shell of the car, Jamal's heart pounded, not from fear but from determination. He knew this wasn't just about him. He knew there was more at stake than his dignity. And he also knew something the officers could not yet imagine, that the truth of who he was would soon turn their arrogance into silence, their certainty into dread, and their laughter into reckoning. The ride to the station was suffocating, the silence heavy with everything unsaid. When they arrived, the contrast to the outside world was stark. Gray walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and the low hum of activity filled the air. As Jamal was led through the booking process, whispers began to ripple among the staff. He didn't look like the usual suspects they saw. He didn't act like them either. There was something about him, a quiet authority, a confidence that seemed out of place in handcuffs. When Riley announced his name at the booking desk, Jamal West, an officer's fingers froze on the keyboard. His eyes flicked up briefly before he typed again, his face betraying a faint frown. No words were spoken, but the silence was heavy with something unseen. Jamal was fingerprinted, photographed, and shoved into a holding cell. Jenkins sneered, "Make yourself comfortable. You'll be here a while." Jamal sat quietly, folding his hands in his lap, refusing to bite at the bait. He knew better than to waste his strength on small battles. The war, he knew, was only beginning. In the corner of the station, a younger officer named Stevens had been watching everything with careful eyes. Unlike Riley and Jenkins, he wasn't hardened by cynicism or corrupted by prejudice. When he heard the name Jamal West, something stirred in his memory. Later, as Riley passed him, Stevens leaned closer and whispered, "You know who that is, right? He's not just some lawyer. He's the Jamal West, civil rights attorney, major cases, big deal." Riley's smirk faltered for the first time. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, and in that instant the foundation of their arrogance began to crack. Because Jamal West wasn't just another man in a suit. He was a storm waiting to break. Whispers of the truth. The holding cell was a box of shadows and silence, its gray concrete walls pressed in with a kind of suffocating weight, and the cold metal bench along the side did little to offer comfort. The faint smell of bleach and rust hung in the air, a reminder of the many forgotten souls who had sat in the same place before Jamal. Yet unlike so many others, Jamal sat with a composure that seemed almost defiant. His hands rested on his knees, his posture upright, his gaze steady. There was no panic in his eyes, no outburst of rage, no pleading for mercy. If anything, the stillness of his demeanor unsettled the officers who glanced at him from the other side of the bars. For a man accused of resisting arrest, he looked remarkably like someone who had nothing to hide. Riley and Jenkins had retreated to their desks, trying to mask the unease that had crept into their minds. They laughed louder than necessary, spoke with exaggerated bravado, but their glances betrayed them. Every so often, Riley's eyes darted back toward the holding cells, as though he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something about this morning was about to turn against him. Jenkins, less subtle, muttered under his breath about troublemakers in suits and wannabe lawyers. But even his voice carried the faintest tremor of doubt. It was Officer Stevens who finally broke the fragile silence. He was younger than most of the men in uniform there, and though still green in experience, he carried with him a curiosity that had not yet been crushed by routine. He approached the duty computer, typed in Jamal's name with cautious fingers, and waited as the system pulled up records. What he saw made him stiffen. His suspicion had been correct. This was no ordinary man. The articles attached to the file weren't about minor court cases or neighborhood disputes. They spoke of landmark victories, federal appeals, and civil rights lawsuits that had shaken entire systems. Jamal West's name was not a small one. It was wispy, read in courtrooms across the country, printed in headlines that declared him a defender of the voiceless, a challenger of injustice, a man who had already stood against walls stronger than these. Stephen swallowed hard. He debated for a moment whether to keep this knowledge to himself or to speak up. In the end, the weight of conscience pressed too heavily on his chest. He leaned closer to Riley, lowering his voice so the others wouldn't hear. "You need to know who that man is," he said carefully. "That's Jamal West. He's not just a lawyer. He's the civil rights attorney. I read about him in the news. He's been on cases that went all the way to the Supreme Court. He's represented people nobody else dared to stand for. You don't understand what you've done by bringing him in here." For the first time since the arrest, Riley's smirk faltered. His jaw tightened as if to mask his reaction, but the truth had landed. Jenkins, overhearing, scoffed. "So what? He's still in cuffs, ain't he? Doesn't matter who he thinks he is. In here, we run the show." His words carried arrogance, but they rang hollow even to his own ears. Riley muttered something non-committal and turned away, though unease rippled through him like a stone dropped into still water. Minutes stretched into an hour. The hum of the station went on. Phones rang. Officers shuffled papers. The low chatter of routine business filled the air. Yet beneath it all was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Jamal's presence was no longer just another arrest to log in the books. It was a question mark hanging over the entire room. The tension was broken when the door to the holding area opened and a woman stepped in. Lieutenant Kate Thompson was new to this precinct, transferred only weeks earlier, but her reputation had traveled ahead of her. Sharp-eyed, composed, and intolerant of anything less than integrity, she was not the type to overlook inconsistencies. She carried herself with an authority that didn't need to shout. Her gaze swept over the room, and conversations quieted without her saying a word. She turned her attention to Riley and Jenkins. "I heard you brought someone in this morning," she said, her tone even but probing. "Jamal West. What's the charge?" "Resisting arrest," Riley answered quickly, too quickly, his voice carrying the rehearsed cadence of someone sticking to a script. He matched the description of a suspect. When questioned, he refused to cooperate. Thompson's eyebrow arched. Refused to cooperate, or asked why he was being stopped? Her question cut with precision, exposing the thinness of his excuse. Riley hesitated. Jenkins shifted his weight uncomfortably. Thompson's instincts, honed over years of seeing stories bent and twisted, told her there was more here than she was being told. "Take me to him," she ordered. The walk to the holding cells felt heavier than it should have. Riley led the way, his back straight, but the beads of sweat forming at his temple betrayed him. When they reached Jamal's cell, Thompson paused. Her gaze fell on the man inside, and she was struck not by defiance or fear, but by calm composure. Jamal sat as though he were the one in control, as though he were merely waiting for the inevitable turn of events. It was a rare thing to see in a cell, a man who looked as though the walls around him were temporary inconveniences, not defining boundaries. "This is him?" Thompson asked. "Yes, ma'am," Riley confirmed, like I said, resisting arrest. Thompson's eyes lingered on Jamal for a long moment before she spoke again. "Open the door." Riley blinked, caught off guard. "Ma'am?" "You heard me," Thompson repeated, her voice steady. "I want to speak to him." The keys jingled reluctantly in Riley's hand as he unlocked the cell. Jamal lifted his gaze, meeting Thompson's eyes with the kind of measured calm that held more weight than anger ever could. She stepped inside, closing the distance between them. "Hi," her voice low but firm. "Mr. West, my name is Lieutenant Thompson. I'd like to hear your version of what happened this morning." Jamal studied her for a moment before replying. His voice was deep, steady, and deliberate. "Officers Riley and Jenkins stopped me without explanation. I complied with their requests, handed over my ID, and answered their questions. When I asked why I was being stopped, I was accused of matching a suspect. When I explained that I was heading to work, I was forced against my car, cuffed, and accused of resisting arrest. I have not resisted anything. I have not broken any law. And yet, here I am." The words hung in the air, unshakable and undeniable. Thompson felt the weight of them settle in her chest. She turned her head slowly toward Riley, whose jaw was set tight, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Jamal leaned forward slightly, his gaze never wavering. "You can check the diner's cameras, you can speak to the witnesses on the street. You can review the recordings on the phones of bystanders. I don't need to defend myself, Lieutenant. The truth will defend me." Thompson exhaled softly. She could feel the eyes of the station on her, waiting to see how she would respond. In her years of service, she had learned that moments like this defined more than cases. They defined legacies. What she decided in this room would echo far beyond the walls of the precinct. Outside the cell, Stevens shifted uneasily. He knew the storm was only beginning. And though Riley and Jenkins clung stubbornly to their version of events, the cracks were spreading. The truth had entered the room, and once it did, it could not be silenced. Jamal West sat back again, his hands folded calmly, his voice echoing in Thompson's mind. "The truth will defend me." And as she turned to leave the cell, her thoughts whispered the same question the rest of the station was beginning to wonder: who exactly is Jamal West? Cracks in the blue wall. The precinct was alive with its usual rhythm, phones ringing, papers shuffling, officers moving briskly from desk to desk. Yet beneath the ordinary hum was a current of unease that few could ignore. Whispers traveled faster than reports, and by now, nearly everyone in the building had heard the name: Jamal West. It carried a weight that was impossible to dismiss. Some recognized it instantly, others only vaguely recalled headlines. But the effect was the same. Suspicion had shifted. For the first time, it was not Jamal who was under the microscope, but the officers who had dragged him in. Jamal himself remained composed in the holding cell, his body language a study in quiet defiance. He sat with his back straight, his gaze occasionally lifting to the window near the ceiling where daylight streamed through in thin strips. He knew time was working in his favor. Every minute that passed meant more eyes on his case, more chances for the truth to leak through the cracks. And cracks were forming. He could feel it. The energy in the precinct had changed from smug certainty to watchful hesitation. Lieutenant Thompson was among the first to sense it. She had left the holding area earlier with Jamal's words echoing in her mind. "The truth will defend me." She had seen many suspects make bold claims, but there had been no bravado in Jamal's voice, no desperate attempt at bluffing. Instead, there was something heavier, something rooted in conviction. And conviction was not so easily dismissed. She moved back toward her office, her thoughts already racing through procedure. She would need to review reports, speak with witnesses, and most importantly, determine if Riley and Jenkins had stepped beyond their bounds. Deep down, though, she suspected she already knew the answer. At the front desk, Officer Stevens had been pacing. His conscience gnawed at him like an insistent voice he couldn't silence. He thought of the news articles he had read about Jamal West, the protests he had supported, the lawsuits he had won against cities that thought themselves untouchable, the families he had defended when no one else would stand beside them. This wasn't just a lawyer. This was a man who had built his reputation on tearing down walls of injustice. If Stevens had learned anything from following Jamal's work, it was that wrongful arrests like this never ended quietly. They ended in courts, in press conferences, in reforms that made entire departments nervous. He walked over to Thompson's office door and knocked lightly. She looked up from the stack of papers she had begun reviewing. "Yes?" "Lieutenant," Stevens said, his voice lower than usual, "I need to tell you something about Jamal West." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Go on." Stevens hesitated, then spoke quickly, the words rushing out before he could second-guess himself. "I know who he is. He's been on major cases, civil rights lawsuits, wrongful death suits, you name it. He's not just some man in a suit, ma'am. If we keep him here without cause, this precinct will make national headlines, and not the kind anyone wants." Thompson leaned back in her chair, absorbing the weight of his words. It confirmed what her instincts had already suggested. She tapped her pen against the desk, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Stevens. That will be all." But Stevens didn't leave immediately. He lingered, his eyes betraying his unease. "Ma'am, with respect, I don't think Riley and Jenkins understand who they're dealing with, and I don't think they care. But if this goes wrong, they'll drag the entire department down with them." Thompson gave a single measured nod. "I hear you, officer. Leave the rest to me." As Stevens left, Thompson returned her attention to the file in front of her. Jamal West. The more she read, the more a picture formed of a man who had dedicated his life to exposing the very kind of injustice that had played out on the street this morning. He had fought battles far larger than this, and he had won them. The irony was glaring. Riley and Jenkins had handcuffed not just a man, but a mirror reflecting their own corruption back at them. Meanwhile, out on the street where the arrest had occurred, witnesses were already speaking up. The young man who had recorded the incident had uploaded the footage to his social media. Within an hour, the video had begun circulating, viewed by hundreds, then thousands. It showed everything. Jamal standing calmly, cooperating, asking reasonable questions, only to be forced against his car and accused of resisting. There was no resistance in the video, only restraint. The comments flooded in. Outrage, disbelief, anger at the injustice. By the time Riley and Jenkins returned from their break, smugly carrying their coffee cups, the storm was already gathering beyond the walls of the precinct. Inside the holding cell, Jamal closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. He thought of his father, who had once told him that dignity was not something others could give or take. It was something you carried inside, unshakable, even in the worst circumstances. That memory steadied him. He reminded himself that he had endured worse battles, faced greater odds, and walked away with victories not just for himself, but for countless others. This was another battlefield, and though the setting was different, the principle remained the same. Injustice could only thrive when left unchallenged. It was late in the afternoon when the captain finally arrived. A broad-shouldered man with decades in the force, he carried himself with the authority of someone used to commanding obedience. Yet even his stride slowed as he entered the precinct and heard the whispers. Jamal West's name had already reached his ears before Thompson briefed him fully. By the time he walked toward the holding cells, his jaw was set in a way that suggested the weight of consequence was dawning on him. When the captain stood before the bars, Jamal rose from the bench. Their eyes locked, one man in uniform, the other in handcuffs. The silence stretched before the captain finally spoke. "Mr. West, I've heard your name before." Jamal inclined his head slightly, his voice calm. "Then you know I don't belong here." The captain's lips pressed into a thin line. He turned to Riley and Jenkins, who stood stiffly nearby, their arrogance now beginning to erode under scrutiny. "Tell me exactly what happened." Their story was rehearsed, the same lines they had given before, but under the captain's gaze, the cracks widened. He asked pointed questions, interrupting when their answers faltered. Thompson stepped forward, adding the details she had learned, including Jamal's testimony and the witness accounts beginning to surface. By the end of it, the air in the room was thick with the unspoken truth. Riley and Jenkins had overstepped, and now, with Jamal's identity revealed, their mistake was no longer private, it was monumental. Jamal returned to his seat, calm as ever. He didn't need to argue his case anymore. The truth, as he had said, was already defending him. And as the captain dismissed Riley and Jenkins with a glare that promised consequences, it became clear to everyone watching, the arrest of Jamal West was no longer a routine matter. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The storm breaks. The Unsenshiron. Captain's words lingered in the air long after Riley and Jenkins had been ordered to sit down and write their reports. The shift in tone was unmistakable. The officers who had swaggered into the station that morning with Jamal in cuffs now looked like men shrinking beneath a shadow they could no longer ignore. Their laughter had dried up, their bravado crumbled. Every movement, every glance carried the weight of realization. This was no ordinary case, and they were no longer in control of the narrative. Jamal remained in his cell, still calm, still measured. To the officers watching, it was almost unnerving how composed he was. Most people in custody shifted nervously, shouted in anger, or begged for release. Jamal did none of those things. Instead, he sat as though time itself was his ally, as though he knew that with every passing hour the scales of justice were tilting in his direction. And in truth, they were. By mid-afternoon, the video of his arrest had already gained traction across social media. Clips of him calmly handing over his ID, asking fair questions, and then being forced into cuffs were replayed with captions like, "Lawyer arrested for nothing," and "When innocence isn't enough." Thousands of comments poured in, demanding accountability, tagging news outlets, calling for investigations. Outside the precinct, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the buzz of injustice spreading through the city like wildfire. Some held signs hastily scribbled with markers, others simply stood in silent solidarity, but their presence was a reminder that the walls of the station could not keep the truth contained. Inside, Lieutenant Thompson watched the developments with growing concern. She had always prided herself on upholding the integrity of the badge, and she knew full well that integrity was crumbling in this case. She had sat in on interrogations, reviewed reports, and spoken with witnesses, and each new piece of information only reinforced what her instincts had told her from the start. Jamal West had done nothing wrong. What had begun as an arrest was swiftly becoming an exposure, not of Jamal's guilt, but of the prejudice and abuse of authority that had led to his detention. The captain, too, recognized the danger. He was not a man easily swayed by public pressure, but even he understood the implications. This was not just about one man in cuffs. It was about the department's credibility, about trust in law enforcement, about a system already strained by years of tension. If mishandled, this would not only ruin careers, it would ignite protests, lawsuits, and reforms. And at the center of it all was Jamal, sitting in silence, watching, waiting. When the captain returned to the holding cell, he did not carry the same stiff authority as before. Instead, he approached with the weight of a man who understood he was standing on the edge of something much larger than himself. "Mr. West," he said, his voice steady but softer now, "we're reviewing everything. It may take time, but the truth will come out." Jamal rose slowly from the bench, his eyes meeting the captain's without flinching. "The truth doesn't take time, Captain," he said calmly. "It only takes courage. Courage to admit it when it stands right in front of you." The words struck deeper than the captain wanted to admit. He cleared his throat, nodding slightly, and left without another word. Yet those who overheard knew the balance of power was shifting. Jamal was no longer just a detainee. He was a mirror forcing them all to look at what they had become. Meanwhile, Riley and Jenkins sat at their desks, their faces pale as they tapped out their reports. What had once been a routine exercise in creative wording now felt like digging their own graves. Every word they wrote would be dissected, compared against video evidence, analyzed in the harsh light of scrutiny. Their usual confidence had evaporated. For the first time in years, they realized their badges would not shield them from consequence. By evening, the crowd outside had doubled. News vans pulled up, reporters adjusting their microphones, camera lights glaring against the precinct's glass doors. Statements were demanded, questions shouted, but the officers inside remained tight-lipped. They were trained to maintain silence in moments like this, but silence itself was damning. And all the while, Jamal sat in his cell like the calm center of a storm, unmoved by the chaos swirling outside. Inside the station, Lieutenant Thompson gathered her thoughts. She had reviewed enough now to be certain Jamal's arrest had no merit. She also knew that releasing him quietly would not erase what had happened. This was bigger than one wrongful arrest. It was a moment of reckoning, a chance for truth to stand taller than excuses. As she prepared her report for the captain, she couldn't help but think of the irony. Riley and Jenkins had tried to assert power over a man they believed powerless, only to discover that he was the very embodiment of resistance to such abuse. When she walked past the holding cell later that night, Jamal looked up at her, his gaze calm, his voice soft but unshakable. "It's not me they're afraid of," he said. "It's what I represent. They fear accountability more than they ever feared me." Thompson stopped, her breath catching slightly. He was right. It wasn't just Jamal West in that cell, it was every case he had ever fought, every voice he had ever defended, every injustice he had ever challenged. His presence was no longer about one man's freedom. It was about the conscience of the system itself. And as the night deepened, the city outside buzzing louder with every new headline, it became undeniable. The storm had broken, and by morning, nothing would be the same. The reckoning. The city had not slept that night. Outside the precinct, the crowd had swelled into the hundreds, a sea of voices chanting for justice, their signs bobbing in rhythm with the beat of their anger. Flashing news cameras lit the sidewalks like lightning strikes, capturing every face, every shout, every ounce of indignation. What had begun as a small ripple of outrage had exploded into a wave that the precinct could no longer hold back. The story of Jamal West's arrest had become more than a video on a screen. It had become a symbol, and symbols could not be silenced. Inside the station, the atmosphere was equally restless. Officers moved quickly, some with nervous glances, others with expressions of quiet guilt. Rumors spread through the building like sparks across dry grass. Everyone knew by now who Jamal was, and those who had not recognized his name the day before were now aware of the enormity of the mistake. It wasn't just that he was a respected attorney, it was that he was the attorney, the one who had stood against systemic injustice, who had been featured on national broadcasts, who had spoken in courtrooms where the stakes were nothing less than the dignity of entire communities. His reputation was not simply professional, it was historic. In the holding cell, Jamal sat with the same calm dignity he had maintained from the moment of his arrest. He was not rattled by the chants outside, nor by the chaos brewing within the station. If anything, he looked like a man who had expected this moment, like he had been preparing for it his entire life. His silence was not weakness, it was the silence of a man who knew his words would matter more when spoken at the right time. By morning, the captain convened an emergency meeting with his senior staff. Lieutenant Thompson was there, her face composed but firm, while Riley and Jenkins sat stiffly, their usual arrogance stripped away. They looked smaller somehow, not because of the uniforms they wore, but because of the weight of their guilt pressing down on them. The captain spoke gravely, his voice carrying the authority of a man who understood the crossroads they faced. "This department cannot afford to ignore what has happened here," he said. "We did not just arrest a man. We arrested the very idea of justice that this badge is supposed to stand for. The world is watching, and they will judge us by what we do next." Riley shifted uneasily in his chair, his face pale. Jenkins stared at the table, avoiding eye contact. Neither had the courage to speak. Thompson cleared her throat. "Sir, the evidence is overwhelming. Mr. West complied with their instructions. The video, the witnesses, the reports, they all prove there was no cause for his arrest. Keeping him here even a minute longer would not only be unlawful, it would be immoral." The captain nodded slowly. "Then we have no choice but to release him immediately." The words carried through the station like a verdict. Officers exchanged glances, some relieved, others ashamed. Stevens, standing near the doorway, felt a rush of vindication. He had known from the beginning that Jamal did not belong in a cell, and now, at last, the truth had been acknowledged. When the cell door finally swung open, Jamal rose to his feet with the same quiet strength that had carried him through the ordeal. Thompson stood nearby, her expression one of respect. "Mr. West," she said, "on behalf of this department, I want to apologize." Jamal met her gaze evenly. "An apology is only the beginning, Lieutenant. What matters now is whether this department will learn from what has happened." or whether it will try to bury it. His words cut through the air, undeniable and piercing. Thompson nodded solemnly. You have my word that it won't be buried. As Jamal stepped out of the cell, the sound from outside grew louder. The moment he emerged into the daylight, the crowd erupted in cheers. Cameras flashed, reporters surged forward, microphones thrust into the air. Jamal paused at the top of the precinct steps, the morning sun casting a glow around him as though marking the gravity of the moment. He looked out over the crowd, their chants echoing off the walls of the city, and for the first time since his arrest, he spoke not just to those inside the station, but to the world. I was arrested without cause, he began, his voice steady, carrying effortlessly over the noise. I was treated as though my presence alone was suspicious, as though my dignity could be dismissed with handcuffs. But what happened to me is not unique. It happens every day to men and women who don't have cameras recording, who don't have names recognized in courtrooms, who don't have crowds waiting outside. Today, I stand here free, but too many others are not, and that is why we cannot stay silent. The crowd roared in response, their energy surging like a wave. Jamal lifted his hands slightly, calming them, his voice rising again. I don't stand here as a victim. I stand here as a reminder. Justice is not a privilege. Justice is a right. And it is time we demand it, not just for me, but for every person who has been silenced, dismissed, or abused by the very system meant to protect them. The words reverberated through the crowd, through the cameras, through the airwaves, broadcasting the moment live across the city. In living rooms, offices, and classrooms, people listened and felt the resonance of his truth. Jamal was no longer just a man wrongfully arrested. He was the embodiment of a fight larger than himself, a symbol of courage against oppression. Behind him, inside the precinct, Riley and Jenkins watched from a narrow window, their faces, as were pale, their futures uncertain. Disciplinary hearings, lawsuits, and investigations awaited them. The badges that once gave them unchecked power now felt like shackles of accountability. For the first time, they understood what it meant to be powerless in the face of truth. Lieutenant Thompson stood at the doorway, her arms crossed, watching Jamal with something close to admiration. She had seen many men in her career, some broken by the system, others hardened by it. But Jamal was different. He had turned his arrest into a reckoning, his silence into strength, his release into a declaration. As the chants grew louder and the cameras captured every second, Jamal's final words carried above them all. This is not the end. It is the beginning. The beginning of a demand for justice that cannot be silenced, the beginning of accountability that cannot be denied, the beginning of a reckoning that belongs to all of us. The crowd erupted once more, their voices uniting into a chorus of hope and defiance. And as Jamal stepped down from the precinct steps, surrounded by supporters, the city realized it was witnessing history, not just the release of a man, but the rise of a movement. The officers inside stood in silence, some humbled, some afraid, but all aware of the truth. The man they had once dismissed had forced them to confront the very meaning of justice. And in doing so, Jamal West had become more than a lawyer, more than a defendant. He had become a catalyst, a living reminder that dignity, once defended, can never again be ignored. And so the story of one wrongful arrest transformed into something greater, a monumental reckoning, a turning point, a call to conscience that left not just the precinct but the entire city speechless.